I would like to share some personal reflections on the sacrament service. Have you ever seen the BBC programme Fake or Fortune, where experts seek to discover whether an artwork is genuine? During a late August programme, the people discussed a preparatory sketch by Benjamin West. He was an American artist who lived from 1738 to 1820 and was a favourite of George III. The finished painting was of the Last Supper, and for a while it hung in Windsor Chapel, but now has gone over to America with an exhibition of West's other paintings. This made me think about the last meeting that earthborn Jesus had with his disciples in the upper room. When Jesus said of the bread and the wine, "Eat and drink and remember me," in remembrance of his body and blood that was broken and poured on the cross. This, of course, being the origin of the communion service. I had a strange introduction to the taking and understanding of the sacrament. I was brought up in the Methodist Church, and my parents were part of the church family. But my father did not agree with all of the doctrines of the Methodist Church, and he never took sacrament. The Roman Catholic belief that the transformation of the bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ has been a point of dissension between Protestant and Catholic forever. And of course the Methodist religion did not believe in this magical transformation. But in spite of this, my father didn't like the processes and the formality of the communion service. In Dad's defence, if he needed defence, which I don't really think he did, the sacrament service of my youth were very different to those of the present day. Only those people who were baptised, adult, regular members of the church and attended worship regularly were allowed to take sacrament. Even then it was much more informal than the history of, say, the Church of Scotland in the past, where the table was fenced. In the Methodist services that I attended, the normal process was that the sacrament service was conducted at the conclusion of the main service. This extended the service to at least an hour and 15 minutes, and non-participants were allowed to creep out of the church at the back. Now this wouldn't be possible actually in a church like the Arisaig Church, where the pews are such that you couldn't creep out at the back. You'd have to be seen to leave. Even when I became welcome to take sacrament, I followed my father's lead and did not participate. I used to feel very uncomfortable coming into a church and seeing the sparkling white, ironed and crisp cloths that covered the goblet and the glasses and the bread, until the final revelation when it was all whisked away and there it was. Also the competition between the church ladies as to who could make the best communion loaf. There was also the embarrassment of when you should stand up, when you should walk to the altar, where you should stand at the altar, and when you should go back to your seat. An arrangement where participants can actually remain seated removes this embarrassment, as is the case in our church. But this depends on having sufficient stewards, of course, to bring the bread and the wine round. As I became older and studied the words of the service, I felt my faith was not strong enough for total commitment to the spoken prayer which said, "And they on their part solemnly consecrate themselves to him and to his entire service." And this is a very serious oath. I came to believe that my faith was not strong enough to allow me to feed off Jesus in this way, and I sometimes have doubts to this day. In the past, the sacrament service in the Methodist Church was much more frequent. We had local preachers for 3 Sundays in the month, and then on the 4th, the minister came and the sacrament was served. Ministers were generally on a 3-year commitment to a given church. However, in the 1980s, we attended a very small church in the East Riding of Yorkshire, where the minister was chopped and changed regularly as the circuit boundaries were modified, and we were given a new minister at one time that we had never met. And when he came to see us on his standard pastoral visit, I talked to him about my doubts on taking sacrament, and his advice changed my whole outlook on this service. He suggested that you take the sacrament to strengthen the faith that you have by sharing with Jesus and putting your trust in him, asking him for reassurance. Sacrament is not a reward for a person with perfect faith, but an invitation to doubters to come and feel the presence of Jesus in the taking of bread and wine. And for me, this was a very important conversation. And since that time, I have always enjoyed and felt uplifted by sacrament. Of course, with COVID, this has been suspended, and this aspect of the church is not the same at the moment. On the lighter side, it is a service that can be very much fated to have mishaps and clumsiness. I attended a Church of England service in a very old church in Middle England, accompanying my brother, who still follows our dad and doesn't actually take sacrament himself. The vicar announced the next hymn and went up to the chancel to prepare for communion. From this end of the church, which had very bad acoustic, she did not realise that the very gifted organist was belting out at high speed a different hymn from hymn tune, a different hymn from the one she'd announced. With only about 10 people in the congregation, she didn't realise that nobody was singing. Indeed, she didn't realise for the whole service what had happened until, of course, at the end my brother had to tell her what had happened. When my mother was dying with liver cancer, we were approaching Easter Sunday, and as she'd been a faithful churchgoer all her life, I felt sure she would want to take a last sacrament with my family before she died. And no, I wasn't excluding her sons, but as I mentioned, the eldest doesn't take sacrament, and my other brother is a committed atheist and anyway was in Australia at the time. I asked our daughter Liz and her husband to come for the weekend, and our daughter Bev attended too. Mum was very poorly by this time. Her hearing aid was tuned into the loop, which meant she could hear the service. As we sat in the pew in solemn, silent sadness, Mum started crunching throat sweets very loudly, and then one of us accidentally pinged off the metal clips that hold the white cloths to the pew backs. Then Mum touched her hearing aid and it shot out across the church, well away from where we could bring it back. Well, at this point, because we do have a bit of black humour in our family, we all started giggling, Mum included, so that the atmosphere was completely different to what I imagined. Later, I realised it wasn't my mum that was passionate about attending her last Easter communion. It was I that was desperate to get us all together for the last time to take the communion. She died 2 weeks later, but totally confident in her love and faith in Jesus. Thus, over the years, my feelings about the communion service have changed. Sacrament is a pledge of God's love and a gift of God's life. Jesus takes earthly things, water, bread and wine, and invests them with grace. For the individual, it can be very uplifting and an affirmation of the love of Jesus. As I lately read, the sacrament table is where heaven and earth come together. Amen.